he finished the scene and he says, "Well, Mama," because I was married to her then. He says, "Well, Mama, what did you think of it?" And I said, "You overacted." Imagine me telling him that.
There was a time when the entire world believed Rita Hayworth had everything a woman could ever dream of. Beauty, fame, wealth, men who crossed oceans just to stand beside her. On movie screens, she became desire itself, the unforgettable face of old Hollywood glamour. But behind the famous red hair and dazzling smile lived a woman who often felt painfully alone, long after the cameras stopped rolling. She once revealed a truth that shocked Hollywood forever. Men go to bed with Gilda, but wake up with me. And in that single sentence, perhaps Rita Hayworth explained her entire life. Because while the world worshipped the fantasy called Rita Hayworth, very few people ever truly understood the shy, fragile woman hiding underneath. Through 5 marriages, betrayal, heartbreak, fading fame, and the quiet tragedy of her final years, she kept searching for something Hollywood could never give her: emotional safety. Yet, through all the men who entered her life, the genius, the prince, the singer, the powerful dreamers, one name continued returning quietly to her heart. And before the silence of her final years fully arrived, Rita Hayworth finally revealed the man she never truly forgot. The older man who created Rita Hayworth, Edward C. Judson. Long before the world knew her as Rita Hayworth, she was simply Margarita Cansino, a young girl with dark hair, exhausted eyes, and dreams bigger than Hollywood itself. She had grown up dancing beneath harsh stage lights beside her father, carrying responsibilities far heavier than most young women her age. By the time she arrived in Hollywood, she wanted more than fame. She wanted safety, direction, someone who believed in her future. That man appeared in the form of Edward C. Judson. Judson was much older, confident, experienced, and deeply connected inside Hollywood circles. At first, he seemed exactly like the mentor Rita needed. He promised to guide her career, protect her from failure, and transform her into a major star. And in many ways, he did. Under his control, Margarita Cansino slowly disappeared. Her hairline was painfully altered through electrolysis. Her dark features were softened for American audiences. Her name changed. Her image changed. Even her identity began to change. And suddenly, Rita Hayworth was born. Hollywood loved the transformation. Columbia Pictures pushed her as a glamorous new fantasy for wartime America. Magazine covers multiplied. Powerful men noticed her. The cameras adored her face. But behind closed doors, Rita's personal life grew increasingly unhappy. Judson controlled nearly every part of her career and private decisions. The marriage slowly became less about love and more about management. Friends later noticed something heartbreaking beneath Rita's rising fame. The more famous she became, the quieter she seemed. She had achieved the dream millions wanted, yet she was already beginning to lose herself inside it. Years later, many people close to Rita believed this relationship shaped the sadness that followed her throughout life. The world had fallen in love with the woman Edward Judson created, but very few people ever stopped to ask whether the real Rita Hayworth felt loved at all. And perhaps that loneliness began here, in the very first chapter of her rise to immortality. The genius she loved but could never hold on to, Orson Welles. By the early 1940s, Rita Hayworth had become one of the most desired women in the world. Soldiers carried her photographs during the war. Studio executives treated her like priceless treasure. Newspapers called her the ultimate Hollywood goddess. But privately, Rita still longed for something deeper than admiration. She wanted someone who could see beyond the image. Then she met Orson Welles. Welles was unlike anyone she had ever known. Brilliant, mysterious, intense. He spoke about art, literature, music, and life with a confidence that fascinated Rita. Unlike many men around Hollywood, He did not seem hypnotized by her beauty alone. He spoke to her like she was a real person beneath the glamour. For perhaps the first time in years, Rita felt emotionally understood. Their romance quickly became one of Hollywood's most talked-about love stories. When they married in 1943, the world saw them as a perfect union between beauty and genius. Together they had a daughter, Rebecca Wells, and for a brief moment, Rita appeared genuinely hopeful about the future. But love inside Hollywood often struggles to survive reality. Wells lived inside creativity, chaos, and constant ambition. Rita, despite her glamorous image, secretly craved peace, simplicity, and emotional stability. The more famous they became, the more distant their worlds started to feel. During production of The Lady from Shanghai, Wells famously cut Rita's legendary red hair short and dyed it blonde for the role. Audiences were shocked, but behind the dramatic transformation stood a deeper truth. Their marriage itself was changing in painful ways. The pressure of fame, work, and emotional misunderstanding slowly pulled them apart. And yet, even after their divorce in 1947, something between them never completely disappeared. Years later, Orson Welles still spoke about Rita with tenderness and regret. Friends close to him believed he never truly stopped loving her. But sometimes two people can deeply love each other and still fail to build a peaceful life together. For Rita Hayworth, that realization became another quiet heartbreak hidden behind the flash of Hollywood cameras. The prince who promised her a fairy tale, Prince Aly Khan. After the emotional collapse of her marriage to Orson Welles, Rita Hayworth was exhausted by Hollywood. The endless cameras, studio pressure, gossip columns, and public expectations had begun to drain something inside her. She no longer wanted to be simply a fantasy on a movie screen. Deep down, she wanted escape, a quieter life, a softer life. Then came Prince Aly Khan. To the world, their romance looked like a storybook fantasy. A glamorous Hollywood star falling in love with an international prince-like figure connected to royalty and immense wealth. Newspapers could not get enough of them. Photographers followed them across Europe. When they married in 1949, the wedding became global headline news. Rita Hayworth was no longer only a movie goddess. She had become something even larger, a symbol of elegance, beauty, and royal romance. For a moment, Rita truly believed she had found peace. Away from Hollywood, she imagined a more meaningful life centered around family and emotional stability. The couple welcomed their daughter, Yasmin Aga Khan, and Rita devoted herself deeply to motherhood. Friends noticed that when she was with her children, the sadness in her eyes often softened. But fairy tales can disappear quietly. Prince Aly Khan carried a reputation that followed him everywhere. Charming, wealthy, sophisticated, but unable to remain faithful for long. Rumors of other women slowly surrounded the marriage. Rita, who already struggled with trust after previous heartbreaks, began feeling emotionally abandoned once again. Behind the luxurious hotels, royal gatherings, and glamorous photographs, loneliness returned to her life. The marriage collapsed in 1953. For Rita, the divorce became more than another failed relationship. It shattered the dream that love could rescue her from the emptiness fame had created. Even royalty, wealth, and worldwide admiration could not guarantee emotional safety. And somewhere deep inside, Rita Hayworth began realizing a painful truth. The more the world envied her life, the more alone she often felt living it. The marriage that left her emotionally exhausted. Dick Haymes. By the time Rita Hayworth met Dick Haymes, something inside her had already begun to change. The glamorous smile that once lit up movie screens across the world still appeared for photographers and premieres, but away from Hollywood parties and flashing cameras, Rita was growing emotionally tired. Years of disappointment had quietly drained the hopeful young woman she once used to be. She no longer searched for excitement in love. She searched for peace. At first, Dick Haymes seemed capable of giving her that peace. He was charming, handsome, and carried the soft confidence of a popular singer adored by audiences across America. Around him, Rita briefly appeared lighter again, as though she desperately wanted to believe happiness was still possible for her. When they married in 1953, newspapers celebrated the romance like another glamorous Hollywood fairy tale. But behind the headlines, Rita was already carrying invisible exhaustion few people truly understood. And slowly, the cracks began to appear. Haymes struggled with financial problems, career instability, and personal troubles that constantly followed the marriage. Public scandals surrounded him. Arguments became more frequent. Tension slowly replaced tenderness inside their home. Friends close to Rita later said she often looked emotionally worn during this period, quieter than before, as though each new disappointment was becoming harder for her to survive. One evening, after a public appearance, Rita reportedly returned home, sat silently in front of her bedroom mirror, and slowly removed her makeup while staring at her own reflection for several minutes without speaking. The applause from earlier that night was still echoing in her ears, yet inside the room there was only silence. And perhaps that moment revealed the painful truth of her life more clearly than any movie ever could. The world still saw Rita Hayworth as fantasy itself, beautiful, untouchable, admired by millions. But privately, she was becoming a deeply lonely woman struggling to feel emotionally safe anywhere at all. She had spent years trying to become everything others wanted her to be: glamorous, graceful, understanding, supportive. Yet peace continued slipping further away, no matter how hard she tried to hold on to it. The stress affected her deeply. Some people around her began noticing changes in her mood, memory, and emotional stability, though very few understood what was truly happening beneath the surface. Hollywood was not kind to women growing older, especially women carrying invisible pain. Their marriage ended in divorce in 1955, and by then, Rita no longer approached love with youthful hope. Something quieter had replaced it. Not bitterness, not anger, just exhaustion. The final marriage before the silence began. James Hill. When Rita Hayworth married James Hill in 1958, she was no longer the carefree young woman Hollywood had introduced to the world years earlier. The glow of old studio glamour was beginning to fade, and Rita herself seemed emotionally worn from a lifetime of disappointment, public pressure, and broken relationships. Still, somewhere deep inside her remained a small hope that peace might finally be possible. James Hill appeared calm, intelligent, and dependable. Compared to the chaos of some earlier relationships, he seemed capable of offering Rita a quieter chapter of life. Friends hoped this marriage would protect her from the emotional storms that had followed her for years. And at first, Rita genuinely tried to build a stable home and rediscover some sense of normal happiness. But by this stage of her life, something more frightening had quietly begun happening. Rita started struggling with memory lapses, confusion, and emotional unpredictability. At the time, very few people understood what these symptoms meant. Some around Hollywood unfairly assumed she had become difficult or emotionally unstable. Others blamed alcohol. In truth, the early signs of Alzheimer's disease were slowly entering her life, though the illness was not yet widely recognized or understood by the public. The misunderstandings placed enormous pressure on the marriage. James Hill later admitted he often struggled to understand what Rita was going through emotionally. Arguments increased. Isolation deepened. The woman who had once lit up movie screens across the world now seemed increasingly lost inside her own private confusion. Their marriage ended in 1961. For Rita, this final divorce carried a different kind of sadness. It was no longer simply heartbreak. It felt like the slow closing of an era. Hollywood had moved on to younger stars, and the glamorous image that once defined her life no longer protected her from loneliness. And quietly, almost without the world noticing at first, the great Rita Hayworth began fading into silence, carrying memories of love, regret, and longing that never fully left her heart. The man she never truly forgot, Glenn Ford. Of all the men who entered the life of Rita Hayworth, the husbands, the powerful producers, the wealthy lovers, the famous dreamers, one name continued returning quietly through the years like a memory she could never fully leave behind. Glenn Ford. Their connection began during the filming of Gilda, the movie that would become one of the most iconic films in Hollywood history. On screen, their chemistry felt electric, filled with tension, passion, vulnerability, and pain. Audiences believed the emotions were real because, in many ways, they were. Unlike many people in Hollywood, Glenn Ford seemed to understand something essential about Rita. Beneath the glamorous image and international fame, he recognized the shy, fragile woman hiding underneath. Rita never appeared fully comfortable with celebrity life. She often felt safer away from large crowds, away from attention, away from the version of herself the world demanded to see. Around Glenn, friends noticed she seemed calmer, more natural, less afraid of being emotionally exposed. Their relationship never followed a simple path. Timing, marriages, careers, and personal struggles repeatedly pulled them apart. Yet, through the years, Hollywood insiders quietly whispered the same thing. Rita always carried a special place in her heart for Glenn Ford. Some biographers later claimed they reunited emotionally more than once over the decades, even after other relationships had ended. And when Glenn Ford spoke about Rita later in life, there was still tenderness in his voice. Not scandal, not bitterness, but sadness and affection. Perhaps that is why so many people believe Glenn Ford was not merely another romance. He was the man who understood her loneliness. Not every great love becomes a lasting marriage. Sometimes the deepest love is simply the person who sees your wounds without asking you to explain them. And for Rita Hayworth, after years of searching for peace in a world obsessed with her beauty, that quiet understanding may have mattered more than anything else she ever found. In the end, Rita Hayworth spent her life surrounded by admiration, yet quietly searching for something far simpler than fame. The world saw beauty, glamour, and fantasy, but behind the cameras lived a shy woman who only wanted loyalty, emotional safety, and peace. She gave Hollywood an unforgettable image, but somewhere along the way, Margarita Cansino slowly disappeared beneath the legend called Rita Hayworth. And perhaps that is why her story still touches people generations later. Because beneath the fame was a woman carrying a loneliness few ever noticed. Maybe that is why Glenn Ford remained so important to her heart. Not because he rescued her, but because he seemed to truly understand her. If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below.